Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 7.2, and we'll be talking about trade, capital flows, and global markets. Specifically, in this video, we'll be discussing net exports, net capital flows, and how the two are linked. So let's start off with net exports first. Net exports, remember, are exports minus imports. Specifically, net exports are capturing the difference between the goods produced at home and sold abroad minus the goods produced abroad and sold at home. When net exports are greater than zero, a country is running a trade surplus, telling us that they are exporting more than they are importing. If net exports are less than zero, then the country is running a trade deficit, and it is importing more than it is exporting. Some factors that determine the level of exports and imports into a country include the tastes and preferences of buyers at home and abroad, the prices of goods at home versus abroad, exchange rates, the incomes of households, transportation costs, and government policies towards trade. Now, let's talk about net capital flows. Capital flows capture the financial flows between countries, specifically in the purchases of bonds, stocks, real estate, etc. When we calculate net capital flows, it is the difference between foreign assets purchased by domestic residents minus domestic assets purchased by foreign residents. When we have net capital inflows, this is telling us that the home country is receiving more financial inflows than it is sending out. On the other hand, net capital outflows tell us that the home country is sending out more financial assets than it is receiving. There are two types of foreign investment. The first is what we call foreign direct investment, or FDI. In this case, a foreign entity or a foreign firm goes and sets up shop in another country. Here, they are setting up a factory, they are purchasing machines, they are setting up a business, and the foreign entity remains in control of the business. On the other hand, we have foreign portfolio investment. And here, a foreign firm or a foreign entity is investing in a country in the financial sense. So it is buying stocks or bonds, etc. And the domestic businesses remain in control. There are a number of factors that influence net capital flows, including the real interest rate in the home country, the real interest rate in the foreign country, the perceived economic and political risks of keeping assets abroad, and government policies that may restrict foreign ownership of domestic assets. Now, let's bring these two together. Recall in the last video, we were talking about the balance of payments that's made up of the current account and the capital account. Remember, the current account is mainly made up of net exports, whereas the capital account is mainly made up of financial flows between countries, or capital flows. So what we know is that net exports and net capital flows are going to equilibrate to bring the balance of payments equal to zero. Let's think of an example, for example, when we have a trade surplus. So a trade surplus tells us that we're exporting more than we are importing. In other words, the country is receiving foreign financial currency that it can then use to purchase financial assets abroad. So with positive net exports, a trade surplus, we will have net capital outflows. On the other hand, if we have a situation where a country is running a trade deficit and it is importing more than it is exporting, well, then it needs to sell domestic assets to be able to cover the cost of purchasing those foreign goods. And therefore, we will have a net capital inflow. When we think about international transactions, they are all involved in exchange. When a seller country transfers a good or service to the buyer country, then the buyer country has to give up some of their assets in exchange for those goods or services. The net value of goods or services that are bought will be offset by the net value of the financial transactions. In other words, what we will see is that the real exchange rate is going to equilibrate the net export market and the net capital flows market. Now, there are scenarios where a government is concerned about competition from abroad. And in some cases, it will work to try to put up what we call trade barriers to make it more difficult for foreign products to enter into the country. By doing so, it tries to boost the production for domestic producers. Two types of trade barriers that exist are tariffs, which is a tax on imports, and trade quotas, which specifically set a limit on the total number of imports that can come into a country. Now, trade barriers may be beneficial for an individual firm or an individual industry, but overall they tend to hurt the economy. The reason is because trade barriers tend to lower the total amount of traded goods, they tend to increase the price of traded goods, and they tend to hinder the benefits associated with comparative advantage and specialization. So what have we learned in this video? Well, we've got into great depth about what are net exports and what are net capital flows. We've linked these two markets together, and specifically we see that the real exchange rate is going to adjust so that these two markets come into equilibrium. Trade barriers, though they may seem beneficial to a handful of firms or industries, they actually end up hurting the economy as a whole. Thanks so much for joining me in Module 7.2.